Tonight on Perspective.
Wakati watu wanaingia mpanic, wanafanya mavitu mbalimbali haistahili.
Time for another fresh look at the world around you. Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of Perspective. I'm John Allen Namu. Thanks for joining us. Now we continue with our focus on Ebola this week, but this week there's no tasting of monkey meat. A lot of you ask me online what it tastes like, and I'm not telling. But we do have a very fresh and interesting take on the Ebola response from various African countries, so stick around for our main feature. Right now, let's get into what was making headlines this week on Headline versus Bottom Line. Local newspapers and TV stations have reported a lot about the Obama visit, from the arrival of the beast to the many security protocols being checked off ahead of the American president's visit. That's the headline. The bottom line is that journalists, all journalists in all media houses, need to take a moment to consider why Barack Obama is visiting. It isn't to visit Kogelo or to marvel at Nairobi's infrastructure facelift, but to attend the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. There has been precious little focus on the opportunities that present themselves for business in Kenya and the region through the summit, or the politics around trade between Western states and Africa, for instance. That a summit of this nature would be held in Kenya gives the media an opportunity to examine Kenya's and Africa's economic future, something that will likely make more of a difference to the average news consumer than knowing how many vehicles are in the US president's security detail. Time now for our main feature, and in our final episode of our series on Ebola, we're telling three stories in one. The first story is about how an outbreak from 20 years ago is informing the current search for a cure for Ebola. The second is about interventions in Uganda that show how well prepared African countries are to deal with the spread of Ebola. And the third is a heart-rending story about the toll that Ebola has taken on African health professionals. No time to waste, so let's get right into it. Here is our final series on Ebola, Incase of Ebola. It started with a 2-year-old in Guinea, and before long it had spread from Guinea to Sierra Leone to Liberia. Names of the dead became numbers of the dead, so many that you could hardly keep up, from tens to hundreds, from hundreds to thousands. There has never been an Ebola outbreak like the one experienced in West Africa. In fact, the mortality rate seen within this latest outbreak of Ebola is the worst of any disease in recent memory. As at the 12th of July 2015, according to the Center for Disease Control, that death toll stood at 11,261 people. Over 90% of these deaths were of Africans. All over West Africa, the fog of a war with a vicious disease is still heavy, but it is lifting. There's a decline in the rate of infections in West Africa, and the end of the virus reign is on the horizon for Liberia. But even in the tragic circumstances of the Ebola virus, lessons were being learnt as other African nations watched. For many on the African continent, the story here was about tragedy, but also about how Africa could pull together to help defeat Ebola. Strategies on how to stop the spread of Ebola were varied, but they narrowed down to 3 areas: research, prevention, and volunteer treatment. This is a story of all 3.
Hundreds have died here since the outbreak began in May.
In the West African countries of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea,
The world's media focused on what was happening in the world's best laboratories outside of Africa to resolve a crisis that was washing up on their shores.
But those people who feel like a vaccine is just around the corner.
Then came the story of American nurse Nina Pham.
A U.S. nurse who caught Ebola while treating a Liberian patient who died of the disease has received a plasma transfusion donated by a doctor who beat the virus.
A woman who potentially had been healed by blood that once carried the virus that would kill her. Specifically, the plasma from blood of Ebola survivors. Plasma is clear liquid that remains when white blood cells, red blood cells, and other components are removed. As Nina was embraced by her president, the World Health Organization was looking seriously at the possibility that plasma from the blood of Ebola survivors could be the cure they were searching for. Outside of the conversations within the medical community, little was said about the place where this was first tested. In the country that gave Ebola its name, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I went there to Kikwit in Bandundu province. In 1995, after what was then the worst Ebola outbreak in its history, 175 people would die there. But 7 emerged from the grips of death. 8 had plasma from survivors' blood transfused into theirs. 7 survived. One of the 8 was Norbert Mabanza. Norbert worked at the Kikwit District Hospital, where patient 0 from the 95 Ebola outbreak was brought and contracted the virus from a nurse that treated this patient.
It
was truly very difficult to imagine that I would survive because I knew that this disease was deadly and had no treatment. But I'm very happy that I survived and thank God for a second life.
The memory of the feeling he had when he realized he was healed is as fresh as the morning during which we meet. But even fresher was a memory of what happened to his blood soon after.
My blood samples were then taken to the CDC in Atlanta and they confirmed that I was cured of Ebola and that there were some antibodies in my blood that were fighting the virus.
In Kinshasa, the capital, Health Minister Dr. Felix Kabange Numbi beams to me about Congo's and the continent's lead in developing a cure for Ebola on the continent itself.
Ni kweli wandugu zetu kutoka Amerika, kutoka France, kutoka UK wanaweza kutusaidia, lakini juu ya expertise na juu ya kuona namna gani tunaweza kufanya sisi watoto wa Afrika sisi wenyewe.
Norbert may be happy about his involvement in what was the first use of plasma in this way to attempt to treat Ebola. But down the road from where he is, 60-year-old Titi Mbana is bitter.
I was the first to use plasma transfusion on a sick person called Nganda Nicole. It was the first time the system was used in Congo, and I was the first one to do it.
He worked with Norbert at the Kikwit District Hospital 20 years ago when a 95 outbreak began. His gripe is that he allegedly never got any credit for this.
We did not get any recognition, not a medal or a certificate from the president. A lot of the information we got is not being used here.
Titi may very well have been involved with this first pioneering technique in the treatment of Ebola, but because there was no control group also given this blood, the results from this couldn't be verified. The trial use of whole blood from Ebola survivors, or just plasma as a potential cure, is based on the belief that antibodies in the blood of survivors can cure Ebola patients. And 20 years after the technique was first used on the continent, its potential as a cure to a hemorrhagic fever that has caused so much trauma raises Africa's profile as not only the cause, but a potential cure. Africa's experience with the Ebola epidemic is informing so much of the global response to Ebola. But up next on Perspective, we tell you the story of Dr. Samuel Muhumza from Uganda. And his story is one that many health professionals across the continent can relate to. Stay with Perspective.